They can't all be masterpieces, as you'll see in NES Works episode 90. New developer, old publisher. Here's two from Nichibutsu, aka Nihon Bussan, a regular fixture of early 80s arcades. And they're brought to us by FCI, who seemingly have moved along from compile releases in favor of this new licensee. Seicross and MagMax technically do not have any sort of narrative relation, nor do they belong to a series of any sort. However, you need only take a quick glance at the two to recognize the fact that they form a pair. Honestly, that seems to work to the game's disadvantage. Most publishers liked to space out releases that overlapped too heavily to minimize the likelihood of them cannibalizing one another. Consider Konami and its recent slate of cooperative shooters. CONTRA, Life Force, and JACKAL all shipped months apart, and even then JACKAL seems to have taken the bum end of the stick. As the last release in this trio, it's also the least beloved among NES fans. When a console library only has about 100 games in it, there's a very real danger that players will turn up their noses to too many overly similar titles. And that certainly seems to be the case with both of Nichibutsu's NES debut titles. Neither of these top anyone's list of all-time favorite NES games, and even back in the day, official propaganda rag Nintendo Power couldn't drum up enough enthusiasm about either one to post more than a screenshot and a couple sentences of lukewarm text. Of course, Seicross and MagMax had more than mere overlap working against them. They also had an undeniable sense of obsolescence to overcome. As auto-scrolling horizontal shooters, MagMax and Seicross had to stand up to the likes of Gradius and Life Force in order to stand out. Needless to say, these being FCI-published games, they did not come close to meeting that standard. When these games originally debuted in arcades in 1985, both fared reasonably well thanks to the inclusion of a few interesting mechanical and technical gimmicks. For starters, they looked pretty impressive thanks to their use of a scanline-based parallax effect that created an illusion of three-dimensional depth that you rarely saw in games at the time. Although this did little to affect how the games actually played, it did at least give a sense of dimension to the action. Rather than taking place in the void of space or whatever, both games present players zooming along the ground at high speeds, moving into the background rather than simply moving up. The only significant impact this has on the action is to change the nature of the interactions between objects. In most shooters of this vintage, the entirety of a player's fighter or ship needs to dodge bullets or obstacles in order to avoid destruction. Any visual overlap between the two amounts to a hit, which usually means you lose a life. Not so in these games. Both your character and the objects around them possess an attribute of height that allows them to avoid hazards by walking in front of them. Even if a bullet appears to pass through your ship, it sails harmlessly past if they don't occupy the same horizontal line. MagMax does more to play on this concept, having originally been created after Seicross. In MagMax, you need to build the Zeta Gundam in order to collect the Yamato's wave motion cannon and destroy King Ghidorah in a courageous battle against copyright. You begin the game as an ersatz Gundam core fighter, skimming along the ground and firing straight ahead at enemy emplacements. This plays out as a fairly standard shooter where your ship's physical profile largely overlaps its hitbox. However, you'll frequently find MagMax components along your way, which you can pass over to dock with and upgrade your fighter. Once you collect both an upper torso and a leg unit, you become a full-sized, giant humanoid mech, towering over the enemy and capable of collecting a wave beam that can take out otherwise indestructible targets. As maxed out MagMax, enemy projectiles can only damage you if they hit your leg unit. The core and head components are immune to the enemy's low-altitude projectiles. If you do take a hit though, you'll lose one of your add-on components and be reduced to either a hovering torso or a pair of ambulatory robo-legs until you can collect a replacement module. This has the effect of making the game remarkably easy for a shooter of its era. MagMax can absorb up to 3 shots when fully assembled, and replacement units appear with surprising regularity. The core fighter ship can't harness the wave cannon on its own, however, meaning that being reduced to your default state also returns you to your default firepower. To make things a little zestier, the landscape is littered with gray platforms that take you into MagMax's underground, where the gameplay format shifts. Although the subterranean sequences still take the form of a vertical shooter, the third dimension does not factor into the action. Instead, these sections play out as a classic side-scroller. This has the effect of turning the fully assembled MagMax into something of a liability, because the shift to flatland means bullets can no longer sail harmlessly behind the robot. Underground MagMax's hitbox encompasses its entire body, meaning enemies can easily box you into a corner and take out your components. The upside to the shift is that each of MagMax's components now fires its own independent weapon, effectively tripling your firepower. If you collect the wave beam, your strength increases even further. The wave beam fires all the way across the screen in the side-scrolling portions, rather than just sweeping the ground at MagMax's feet. It's a decent enough game for a 1985 arcade release, but as a 1988 NES release, it lacks a certain something. The cool parallax scrolling effect obviously didn't make its way to the home console, as the Famicom version of MagMax shipped way back in May 1986, long before cartridge mappers capable of easily futzing about with scanline level screen rendering became available for developers. And honestly, the whole thing is just kind of boring. The underground scenes aren't fun, and the overland areas drag on with only 4 types of scenery punctuated every other stage by the appearance of not legally King Ghidorah, who evidently got sick of Xarian and decided to set up camp here. Still, MagMax manages to be more convincing than Seicross, a racer shooter that runs on the same tech as MagMax but does much less with it. Seicross puts you in command of a racing bike equipped with a forward blaster and very little in the way of upgrades. I was hoping that Seicross would turn out to be some clever pun that combines the Japanese word for star with the word motocross or something. The game was actually just called Sector Zone in Japan, so Seicross apparently translates to Seicross. Your bike can shoot, avoid obstacles, smash into enemy racers, and collect little dudes who appeared scattered about the landscape. Like MagMax, Seicross loses its effective background scrolling effect in its move to NES, but it does employ the same sense of depth and dimension as its sibling release. Obstacles appear throughout Seicross's courses, smashing into anything with your bike equals instant death. However, you can maneuver behind obstacles to reach the space on their opposite side, and a big part of gameplay involves sidling up alongside enemy racers to bump them into the scenery. They can do likewise to you, of course, which is why it's sometimes better to just shoot them with your forward blasters. A less satisfying approach, but nevertheless an effective one. Seicross is a faster, more challenging game than the sluggish MagMax. The speed factors into the challenge level, but more critically, you don't have an upgrade path that allows you to soak up damage. You can shoot power-up icons to improve your weapons slightly, but that's it. Nothing allows you to shrug off a collision with the implacable scenery or an enemy projectile. Take a hit and you die, end of story. On the plus side, Seicross lacks MagMax's annoying perspective shifting, always playing out from a forced 3D perspective. The action does shift between different tempos on alternating stages. Odd-numbered levels move quickly, while even-numbered levels move more deliberately, which proves to be challenging in a different way by allowing enemies to lurk on screen longer and take more potshots at you. Really though, this is a simple score attack game, and all the obstacles and enemies are secondary to the core of the system. Collecting stranded citizens and destroying weird aliens that live in dinosaur fossils. Last one of the dinosaurs and a strange creature will emerge, which you can destroy for a huge point bonus. You'll net even bigger bonuses if you manage to rescue the little blue guys standing around the course and bring them safely to the end of the stage. Beyond that though, Seicross doesn't have a lot of moving parts. It's a simple, basic arcade scrolling action game that looks pretty dated and doesn't do a lot to stand out from the slate of more impressive works making their way to NES at this point. Likewise, MagMax. And while one might have made a novel addition to the NES library, together I feel they actually diminish one another by making the other seem less unique and more disposable. But as we'll come to see, disposable would become the defining trait of FCI's library. So these games are totally on brand. Another new developer arrives alongside Nichibutsu, and a new publisher, since Kemco adopted a Thanos philosophy about bringing video games to NES.
I'll do it myself.
I suppose Spy vs. Spy counts as 2 new developers, really, because Kemco seemingly developed this NES conversion themselves based on a computer game by First Star Software. All of these names will be familiar from Game Boy works, of course. Kemco, aka Kemco-Seika, or Kotobuki Systems, gave us Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle and The Sword of Hope, while First Star Software had also created the original version of Boulder Dash. Spy vs. Spy is nothing like any of those games, mind you. Designer Richard Spitalny originally built it in the shape of a long-running Mad Magazine feature by the late, brilliant Antonio Prohías. Prohías had come to the US in the 1960s from Cuba, driven away by Fidel Castro's decision to nationalize the media. As an opinionated and seemingly liberal-minded cartoonist and satirist, Prohías correctly recognized that his life expectancy under a communist regime probably wouldn't have been particularly long, and fled to the States, where his impressive portfolio landed him a gig publishing for Mad. Prohías actually retired from creating the strip in 1987, meaning that by the time its NES adaptation came along, the feature had been handed over to Duck Edwing and Bob Clark, working in Prohyas' style. That said, Firstar originally published it on home computers in 1984, so the property remained under the eye of its creator at that point. Spy vs. Spy on NES does about as good a job of adapting the themes and premise of the comic as I suppose you could reasonably expect in an 8-bit game. The Mad comic reflected Prohyas' cynicism about global politics based on his lived experiences, namely that the Cold War amounted to a pointless farce. In the comic, two functionally interchangeable spies constantly seek to outperform and undermine the other. Each appears identical but for the color of their suits. One wears white, the other black, but both wear the same cut and sport a large brimmed hat and shades. Technically, the black-clad spy represents communism while the white spy represents the West, but this isn't some commentary about how communism is evil. Each spy managed to gain the upper hand over the other in equal measure from month to month, and both turn out to be similarly incompetent. Exactly the sort of message you'd expect to see in a book run by a left-leaning hippie activist like Bill Gaines. The point being, the spies are both idiots, killing one another without ever gaining a significant advantage. And every once in a while, a gray-clad lady spy would show up to manage to humiliate or kill both of them in the classic Fujiko Mine style. This game doesn't quite capture this jadedness, instead becoming a meditation on how much fun it is to set up another person for failure and win. But to its credit, Spy vs. Spy does introduce an element of futility to the mix. Two players control their spy independently in a split-screen effect similar to the one Atari would use for XENOPHOBE. You can theoretically screen cheat by simply watching your opponent's actions and planning your moves appropriately. In each stage, you need to collect a briefcase and 4 items, then escape. Although you can't die during a mission, the enemy can disable you with traps or direct attacks, knocking you out of the action momentarily and affecting a time penalty on you. If you run out of time, you fail your mission. The two spies can go at it face to face, but that's kind of missing the point. The spaces that comprise each mission are fairly large and consist of multiple interconnected rooms, any of which can contain a critical collectible. Each room can also contain a booby trap set up by the enemy spy. Rather than take on your rival directly, you're better off laying traps, a bomb, a time bomb, a spring, or a water trap, leaving them around for the other player to stumble into as they forage for their mission objectives. Of course, if your rival keeps tabs on you, they can anticipate your traps and come prepared with a correct countermeasure to disable the unhappy surprise you've left laying in wait for them. So there's an element of strategy to the action. And it's fine, I guess. Like MagMax and Seicross, Spy vs. Spy feels like a game out of time and tech, the sort of thing that worked better in its original context than it does here. But also like MagMax and Seicross, Spy vs. Spy appeared on Famicom 2.5 years before its arrival on NES, and it definitely felt it. A port of the sequel, The Island Caper, had actually hit Famicom in 1987, and probably would have been a better choice for US release, but for whatever reason, Kemco never localized it. We've seen a lot of multiplayer-focused games on NES throughout 1988, and Spy vs. Spy definitely fits into that format. But compared to the likes of CONTRA or BOBBLE, it's not especially convincing, even if it is a rare competitive action game rather than cooperative. Kemco would go on to find far greater success with its NES adaptations of other Western-developed computer games and games based on Western cartoon properties, such as Shadowgate and its MacVenture peers and Bugs Bunny. I guess this is a start though, even if, like the Spy's Eternal Mission, it all feels a bit pointless. Next time on NES Works, helpful advice for how to respond when someone asks if you're a god.